Well, hello and welcome to what is going to be the final new episode for 2022. This is Curiosity, Not Judgment. Obviously, this is not Gary sitting here for those of you that are watching by way of video. This is my buddy John Freisinger, and my name is Birga. Gary is traveling, and we will get back in the swing of things for 2023, but wanted to close out strong and have some conversation that's got John pretty excited, and so I'm going to let him introduce the topic for today and why it's top of mind for him.
Thanks, Birga. Yeah, the topic, I guess, itself is how do we suspend or check our ego when we're dealing with others? Because so often it's that ego baggage that we bring to a discussion that limits our ability to maybe see things from the other person's viewpoint. This originally came up because a group that I work with is working with a group of academics on a training program. And if there's one thing that academics have a very strong idea about, it's how training should be deployed.
Right.
And if you put 8 academics in a room, you'll probably have 12 different academic ways in which they want to do something. So how do we get the best out of this group? And one of my colleagues said, wouldn't it be fun if we could find a way in which, like a coat check, they could walk in and they could check their ego at the door? Because if we can leave our egos behind, we can have some very interesting conversations then about the meat of the problem. We can rely on our training and our experience as opposed to our egos when we're dealing with other people. So the idea was, how do you create an ego check?
Okay. So that in and of itself is a curious question, but I would imagine that that also flares up some emotional response if you're going to talk to a room full of academics and propose the process of checking your ego at the door. The immediate response may be, well, hold on a minute.
Right.
You know, something along those lines.
What do you know about training? Right.
How do you present such a concept allowing for the, I don't know, I'm going to say derobing of the ego cloak in such a way that people aren't offended, but really can be curious about why you're asking them to go through such a process?
Well, the intro for us has to do with building a community of trust. So you can have more dynamic conversations with people if there is deep trust.
Yes.
If you, once again, go into a conversation with the curiosity, not the judgment. I think our ego gives us the judgment.
Yeah.
Right? From my position of ego, I'm going to judge what you say, what you do, who you are. If we can suspend that, we can get to the curiosity that may be associated with somebody else. So this group, fortunately, is all PhDs in psychology, specifically positive psychology.
Huh.
And they're one of the groups that we work with or have worked with in the past around the idea of establishing trust within a group.
Okay.
So they recognize that trust is earned and continues to be earned through the actions that you have when you initially engage with the group. And so our proposition to them is, here's an exercise we'd like to try to establish trust within this group very rapidly. And we would like your feedback, once again, trying to help them co-author this solution. We'd like your feedback on this exercise of checking your ego at the door. So when we first proposed it to this group, we got exactly what you would expect, which is, we don't have an ego, we can get beyond this, we don't need this step. And my response was, I think just that response is demonstrating ego.
Yeah.
So if you'll let us try this.
All right, before we get too far down that road, give me your simplistic definition of what an ego is.
What an ego is, yes. We probably need to stay away from the Freudian definition of ego. Ego to me is that which distracts you from being fully engaged with somebody else. So it is the assumptions that you had about where the conversation is going. It's the assumptions you have about the other person. It's that which you brought into the room because you just had to deal with it. Right, so I just got a phone call from my kid and they want $20 for a field trip that they didn't tell me about, right? So it's all the things that distract you from being fully engaged, fully present with someone. And I think too often we can disassociate or at least list all the things that are a distraction, but it's those things that are internal to us that we value that represent that ego that I'm trying to get to a point where we can lower, I'll use the word ego, lower the distraction of my personality in dealing with your personality so that we can create something even better.
That actually is quite different than what I was assuming that you were going to say. And so there is a high degree of judgment in that definition of ego that you just provided. It's the preconceived thoughts, notions, expectations that you have walking in the door prior to the interpersonal engagement that is going to take place. And so the process of severing ties, at least momentarily, with those judgments in order to have a more fully present, fully engaged dialogue.
Great. Yes, I think we're talking in the same vein at this point.
Okay.
And the reason that's important is that's where creativity happens, right? It's that human connection. Once we can get past all of the positioning that we oftentimes have to have. It's why it's so much easier to talk to a friend than it is to a coworker. It's so much easier to talk to your spouse than maybe somebody that you just met on the street. Because we can lower our egos. We feel safe, and that's really what we're after, is how do we create the psychological safety between two people so that we can get into what we're after is something we call flow. We can get into flow between two people, that the meat of a solution can become present. I also, because you and I have had this discussion before, I think this is where God's voice is. Right? We talk about dying to self first. If we can get rid of all of our assumptions, that's when God shows up, right? That's when he starts to whisper to us. And what happens when two or more of us are gathered in God's name? He's present, right? What for me that means is I have to show up empty, egoless. If you show up empty and egoless, he can enter into that room.
That's good.
I didn't mean to go too far into theology there, but
it's
just one of those layers. When I talk about ego, it's the emptying of myself.
I can think about how this would apply in a whole host of scenarios, not just in a room full of PhDs who are psychologists. I can think about it just even in some sitting on the couch conversation with a teen or a 20-something where they're in a position in life that they're struggling through, and we as the parent or we as the authority figure have this judgment, have this ego. Well, I know because I've been there. I have better life experience. I have more lived experience, fill in the blank. And so it automatically taints the conversation, and it really puts a stumbling block in the way of the minor being able to receive. You know, even more so, maybe on steroids by the time you get to 8 PhDs in a room. So are there some common exercises or common practices that we can implement regardless of the circumstance we find ourselves in where the ego really does need to be checked at the door?
Like, for me, it's the first step is just to figure out what we need to have out of this conversation. Sometimes people just want an answer. Right? Just, is it yes or no?
Okay.
Right? So, do you want me to answer the question is usually the first question that I have, right? The second is, do you want me just to listen? Because sometimes people just want to be heard, right? That's process. A key, right? And maybe the third question then is, would you like my opinion? Right? And if you allow the other person to define the conversation, it's a little easier then to establish that trust. So oftentimes my wife and I have this conversation over and over and over again, because sometimes she just wants me to listen, right? She had a bad day. She just wants me to hear her. I'm a guy. I just want to fix it, right? Who wronged you? I'm going to go out there and fix this.
Right.
She just wants me to listen. So we always have that conversation, right? Do you want a solution? Do you want me to listen, or do you want my opinion? And I think too often we confuse, I just need somebody to listen with, I want your opinion. And the reason we have an opinion is we're sitting there waiting for our turn to talk. right? So if we've already established you just need somebody to listen, frees my ego up, right? I don't have to come up with an answer. It's really easy for me then.
But if you're getting responses from the person that's going to tee it off for you to provide a solution or to provide an answer, how do you provide an egoless answer? Because you're right, we start thinking ahead and, okay, if question 1 is answered in my favor and question 2, here we go, I get to answer. How do you turn off the ego?
Well, can I reflect that back to you? How do you turn off the ego in that situation with your daughter who's come in with, I don't know, an issue, a heartbreak? You have years of experience, but then you realize, wait a second, every situation's different. So what do you do?
Well, I will say I don't do this well much of the time. I wish I did it well more of the time, but it is a exercise that I am experiencing every time this type of scenario comes my way. I think the first one, and I don't know if you and I had talked about this or it was an episode that Gary and I had talked about, but listening to hear. And I don't know if this is an American cultural thing. I don't know if this is I don't know what we can attribute it to, but I think many people in my circle, whatever that circle may be comprised of, and it's not just my age or my gender or my, economic status, etc., just people that I do life with in all types of settings, we like to listen to respond. We don't like to listen to hear. And we are always scrapping to have our voice heard and our opinion count and our wisdom, our expertise matter. And so starting at the very beginning, purposing to listen to hear can sometimes do the instant ego check, because when you're not ready with a response, you're not teeing up your answer, then you have a much higher chance of hearing somebody's pain, hearing their struggle, hearing the emotion, the genuine cry behind the words. And when our sympathy or our empathy barometer gets raised, I think the pride ego barometer comes down.
Yeah. Now, I'm going to try something with your audience.
Okay.
Would your audience trust me to ask you for a Kleenex right now?
Sure.
Okay. I'm being very vulnerable. My nose is running. I need a Kleenex. So
There it is.
Just wheel away.
Wipe the nose off camera.
Wheel back.
Okay. Was that the exercise?
No,
Okay.
that was more of an exercise in being vulnerable, right? So I don't want you to edit that out, right?
Okay.
I don't want the people to think, oh, well, he's always perfect, right? My ego tells me I should always be perfect on camera. When are we always perfect? Never, right? We'll be perfect when we die, hopefully. A good friend of mine who was also a priest once told me the easiest way to get past your ego is simply to greet the person with love. One of my favorite movies of all times is Princess Bride.
Yeah.
Okay. And if you remember Wesley at the beginning of the movie, anytime when Buttercup would ask him a question, he would simply say, as you wish.
Yep.
And what did he really mean? He really meant, I love you. Because Buttercup finally figured out what he was really saying was, I love you.
Okay.
Because we also know love is patient, love is kind, love is never boastful. So if your idea here when you're talking with somebody else is, I love you, and it doesn't have to be the passionate love, right?
Sure.
It can be any type of love, right?
Yeah.
It can be even love for a fellow human being. But if in your mind what you're repeating is, I love this person, it's amazing how fast that ego disappears. And it's easier with a daughter. It's
Sure.
easier with a child, right, to look at them and say, I love you. But if we can just keep reminding ourselves of those simple little words, that ego goes away very, very quickly. And that's the only technique I ever use to try to get rid of my ego. The rest of it is naming my ego, right? Walking in and knowing what my ego is to start with. And that's a more complicated discussion. We can certainly have that discussion, but the easiest technique is as you wish.
So that doesn't necessarily work as well with coworkers that you don't have that degree of love for, or somebody with whom you have a history of friction. Is there a next best to thinking about love when you can't generate a love for a person? I mean, does choosing to respect generate that same type of response?
It can. What I would go back to, though, would be, what role are you serving in the conversation with the coworker? What is the traditional role that you have with this person? And there was a psychologist, once again, I guess this is a psychology and religion episode, the psychologist who described the typical dynamic between humans as something called a drama triangle. The psychologist's name was Karpman with a K. And what he described was, most of us fill one of three roles in a contentious relationship. We're either the victim, which a lot of us, that's really easy to become, as the victim in something.
Yeah.
And if there's a victim, there's also a persecutor. So if I don't like the other person, oftentimes that person might be the persecutor of me because I'm a victim. The third role is, and this is something that's very easy for all of us to fall into, which is the rescuer. So if you think about the triangle, the victim being at the bottom, everybody is always on top of them, and then you've got above that, you have either a persecutor or you have a rescuer. Those three roles will always cause conflict, and it may be just below the surface. The key is, if you can identify yourself in any one of those roles, this is that ego check, and you realize, typically when I'm talking to this person, I'm the rescuer.
Right.
It's not healthy. What we need to do is start to think about ourselves in a different dynamic. Today, I'm not going to be the victim. Today, I am going to be the creator.
You're not moving to another point on the triangle. You're exiting the triangle altogether.
Completely leaving that triangle behind, because that drama triangle is inherently a drama triangle. There will always be drama. It may be just under the surface, but there'll always be drama. So if you can move yourself into a creation triangle in which you have a creator at the top, you have a facilitator, a coach, and then a challenger, if you choose to take one of those roles instead, at least you're doing your part to suspend your ego, or at least recognizing that which you're bringing to the situation. And that's the first step of leaving your ego, is, what am I bringing? Because I can tell you, it's nearly impossible for me to change you.
Sure.
Right? For a short period of time, I might be able to manipulate you, but I cannot change you. So in our dynamic, what's the one thing I can change?
You. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have to know what I'm bringing and be able to, if I can't change that, at least suspend it for the period of time in which I'm engaging with that other person, with whom I almost always have a dramatic relationship, right?
Yeah.
It's always bad. And it's tough to do,
Yeah.
right? But step one,
Yeah.
I know it exists, right?
Thinking back to the three roles within that triangle, I can already see that there's actually a high degree of ego, pride, judgment in all three points, right?
Yeah.
Even if you view yourself as the victim, there's almost a little bit of pride associated with that as well, because I've been wronged, I am being marginalized, I am fill in the blank, and because of that, I deserve X. And so there's pride in that corner. The persecutor, I mean, I think that goes without saying. There's a degree of pride there, thinking, I know what I need, I know what is right, I know, right back to the victim. And yet the third point, the rescuer, I could definitely see where I would fall into that category more than I should. I'm very much a peacemaker. I want everybody happy and content. I don't want there to be problems. And yet there's pride in that too, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, I'm going to solve this. I'm going to have you guys work this out. And so.
And there's a lot of good feel-good chemicals with that, right? I rescued you. I am a noble person. Probably not.
Yeah.
Right? Because all that nobility is making you feel better about yourself. Right? But if you were to be a coach for someone, or in the extreme, challenge someone. Once again, heart of love.
Yeah.
That's what gets you there. That's a much different role for you, different chemistry, and it actually feels better.
Yeah.
It's just painful to get there.
Yes, it is. So go back to your room full of PhDs now and talk about how that process went, and were you successful in getting people to hang up their pride cloaks at the door?
Well, this is a to be determined.
Okay.
We have at least an agreement in principle that they will meet and they will go through this exercise. What they don't know is how they're going to go through this exercise. We're actually going to use a physical embodiment of their ego. We're actually going to ask them to build a model of their ego, put it in a little Ziploc bag and check it at the door.
Okay.
But we're going to go around the table and actually discuss the components of everyone's ego. Now, the nice thing about building a model is you can do it in abstract then.
Sure.
This is what an ego, probably mine, looks like. But when we discuss it abstract, it's a lot easier because the focus then is on this, not this, right? And that's what we're having them do is build the ego.
Yeah.
Now, for instance, my ego model, right? I have a tendency to want to talk over people because I feel that makes me important. If I have the talking stick, I'm important. I recognize that's a component of my ego. I also have a compunction, this is just a weird one for me that I grew up with. Somebody once told me the best dressed person in the room is probably the speaker. So I always strive to be the best dressed person in a room. Does that help me with anything? No, maybe some confidence. So that's another component of that. The last is if I give you the opportunity to talk, it somehow diminishes me. Part of my ego. It's not correct, right? No candle is diminished by lighting someone else's candle. But for some reason, not allowing you to talk is part of my ego. So I'm intentionally starting to think through my model that I would represent to this group and what I want to be. Am I a creator or am I a victim? Am I a coach? Am I a persecutor? And those may be components of my model as well.
All right, so I'm curious now if you can help us think through maybe an exercise that folks can do on their own. Obviously, they're not going to be sitting in your room with PhDs and the tools that you're going to present to them. Is this something that we could draw on paper? Is there some sort of, is this a clay modeling? Is this are there some tangible, practical things that we might be able to do? Because now I'm imagining what my ego might look like, right? Is it human-esque? Is it more monster? Is it, what is it? And so I'm now curious to think through that.
Well, I am not an artist by training, but I love what art can represent. And I would just simply say, what's your favorite medium? Right? My artistry, if I am to think about myself as an artist, is in the written word.
Right.
You can write this down.
Yeah.
Right? And maybe write it down in a format which you're not as familiar. So it could be free verse. It could be poetry. Write your ego into a poem.
Interesting.
And by the way, it has to rhyme.
Oh?
Not all the time. Every other line would work out just fine. I'm sorry, that's just a little poem that I wrote at some point. For some of us, it's clay, right? Some people are very tactile. They want to work with clay. For this group, the one thing I found that just about everybody can play with is Legos. We're going to play with Legos.
Okay.
Right? Build it with Legos. And it could be it could be a collage. We've seen people that actually will cut things out of, believe it or not, there used to be this thing called magazines where it had a whole bunch of pictures and words. Some people can do a Pinterest board on their ego.
Oh.
Right. What is your muse? What is your medium? I would just say do it around that. So I would just make sure you protect on Pinterest your ego board,
right,
because you probably don't want that to be a public thing. Or maybe you do.
Oh, that's funny. All right, so we've got just a minute or two left. So,
well, can I ask what your medium might be?
I'm a writer as well.
Okay.
But I also, visual is very important to me also. You know, tactile, great, but if I don't have it, I'm okay with that. but I'm thinking now, and I don't have a quick answer for you because I think maybe it's even multiple mediums, right?
Ah.
I mean, maybe it does get collaged with a little poem narrative next to it, and so my concluding question for this episode. So once we've got it, your Pinterest board, your collage, your poem, whatever it is that you've built, your Lego thing, when you have that ego in front of you, what do you do with it?
So art is meant to be shared.
Okay.
It is a conveyance of our feelings and our ideas. I would share it with someone that you trust.
Okay.
And just start with somebody that you trust. But also recognize that this can be something that can be brought into any meeting in which you want to establish trust. Trust with another individual. I'm not saying walk it in to show it to your coworkers unless you have deep trust with them, but it is a emblematization of that which you believe is in your ego. And the other thing is, it's going to change daily. Right? There are other things that are going to be distractions, which you're not going to even know that it was part of my ego. But the way I responded to that, oh my gosh, that's part of my ego. So share it, and share it with somebody that you trust, and then recognize those components are what you bring to every conversation, every meeting, every conflict that you have. And you don't always have to carry your model around with you, but at least you're aware of it. Most of us aren't aware of our egos. Most of us just go through life, stimulus response, stimulus response, stimulus response. This allows you to pause and say, there's a stimulus. I would normally respond this way. Why? It's my ego.
Interesting. Well, I think we will leave it in your hands now, and whatever format that you would like to use, I would challenge you. Consider what your ego might look like, whether you build it with words or pictures or Legos or clay, sugar cookies, pick your poison.
Video montage.
Ooh. But I think in the grand scheme of things, with the years worth of episodes that we've done now with Curiosity, Not Judgment, that's a great place to leave it. Because as we've discussed, your ego has a huge degree of judgment in it. And once you identify what it looks like, can that help you to let it go, check it at the door, and go forward in relationships with more curiosity and less ego and less judgment? So we will sign off for today. Next week, I will likely play a best of, as we will all enjoy some holiday time off. But back at it come 2023. And as always, welcome your comments, questions, feedback, topic suggestions. You can visit the website curiositynotjudgment.com. There's easy contact information right there. And of course, you can comment on any of the platforms that you are seeing or listening to this on. So with that, we'll wish you a great 2022, and we'll see you next year.